The radio call came in at 3:47, and nobody who heard it would ever forget the words. Alpha 2 is down, I say again, Alpha 2 is down, we have a KIA, request immediate extraction. The voice on the other end belonged to Chief Petty Officer Darnell Hoax, a man who had been in combat long enough that his voice rarely changed tone. But that night in the frozen mountain past 60 kilometers from the Afghan-Pakistani border, his voice had something in it that nobody could quite name. Not panic, not grief, something older than both, something final. The transmission went up the chain within seconds. By the time it reached Commander Elliot Marsh at the Joint Special Operations Forward Base in Coast, the words had already taken shape as fact in the minds of everyone who heard them. Alpha 2 was Lieutenant Commander Sierra Voss, female, Navy SEAL, sniper, attached to Task Force Nightfall as primary long-range precision element, 31 years old, call sign, Cold Front. She was gone. That is what they believed. That is what they reported. That is what the casualty notification team began to prepare for, pulling her emergency contact information from the sealed folder in the intelligence section. Her mother in Tucson, Arizona, who worked the early shift at a hospital laundry and had no idea her daughter was anything more than a naval communications officer. Marsh sat with that folder in his hands for 2 minutes and did not open it. He had sent people to their deaths before. He would again. That was the mathematics of the work. But Voss was different in one specific way that he did not allow himself to say out loud, which was that he had been the one who fought for her deployment, argued for her placement on the team, taken the professional risk of putting her in the field when 3 of the 5 senior officers in his command structure had filed formal objections. Not because she was female, because she was unknown to them, because her background was irregular. Because the way she had arrived at this assignment was not the path any of them recognized. He put the folder down without opening it. He told himself it was operational necessity. There were still 5 operators in the field, still a mission compromised, still a high-value target that had somehow known exactly which mountain trail to avoid, which suggested a leak so deep it ran through the bones of the operation. He had a living problem to solve. He would deal with the dead when the living came home. That is what he told himself. Before we go any further into what happened that night, I want to say something to everyone watching this. If you have ever been told you do not belong somewhere, if you have ever been measured by your category before your capability, if you have ever watched someone else receive credit for a thing that only you knew how to do, stay until the end of this. Because this story is going to say something to you that most stories in this space do not have the courage to say. Subscribe if you haven't yet and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I want to know. Now, let's go back to the mountain. Sierra Voss had been lying in the same position for 11 hours. Not 11 hours of action, 11 hours of stillness. The kind of stillness that most human beings cannot sustain for 11 minutes. The kind that requires a specific training of the mind, a specific relationship with time, a specific willingness to let the body become part of the environment rather than an intrusion upon it. Her ghillie suit had collected frost on the outer layer. The temperature at her hide position was -14°C. The wind was coming from the northwest at roughly 12 to 15 knots, gusting irregularly in ways that created chaotic air pressure over the ridgeline, which was a problem for long-range precision work because gusts at that frequency and unpredictability could move a bullet 8 to 12 inches at the ranges she was working. She was working at a range of 1,140 meters. Her rifle was an Mk13 Mod 7 chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum, a system she had worked with for 4 years and understood in the way a musician understands an instrument, not intellectually but physically, the way certain movements of the hand produce certain sounds in certain air. She had made adjustments to the reticle that she had not entered into any official log because the adjustments were personal, derived from hundreds of hours of range work in conditions nobody else had tested her in, and she did not trust the official log to capture things that lived in feel rather than formula. Her spotter was a man named Calder. Petty Officer 2nd Class Marcus Calder, 26 years old, from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who had been assigned to her 6 weeks earlier as a replacement after her previous spotter rotated out on medical. Calder was competent. He called wind correctly, read terrain well, understood the language of precision work without needing everything explained. But he had not worked with her long enough to know her rhythm, and that gap had shown itself twice in the last 11 hours in small ways. A breath call that was slightly early, a range estimate offered before she had asked for it, nothing dangerous, just evidence of 2 people still learning each other's silences. That gap would matter before the night was over. The target was a man named Khalid Zerari, whose real name was almost certainly not Khalid Zerari, who operated as a facilitation node for a network that moved weapons, money, and occasionally people across a section of mountain border that 3 intelligence agencies had been trying to close for 2 years. He was not a field fighter. He was not a bomb maker. He was something more valuable and more difficult. He was the person who knew the right people on both sides of every wall, and that knowledge had kept him alive and useful and insulated for longer than most men in his position survived. Task Force Nightfall had located him through a chain of signals intelligence that Voss had not been briefed on in full. She had the target description, the target location, the trigger criteria, and the authorization. She did not have the political context, which later she would understand was an intentional omission, and which would be part of what made the night so complicated. The assault element, 5 operators including Hoax, was positioned 800 meters below her on the southern approach to the compound. Their role was secondary to hers. If she made the shot when Zerari emerged to make his nightly satellite call, the assault element would secure the compound and collect intelligence materials. If something went wrong with the shot, misfire, wind event, target behavior change, they would move in on a fast breach and she would provide overwatch. The plan was clean. She had worked cleaner. She had also worked from plans that seemed clean and weren't. At 2:11, Zerari stepped outside. Voss saw him through the scope, first as a heat signature layered on her night vision, then as a physical form as he moved under the single electric light above the compound's rear door. He was taller than the file photographs suggested, which sometimes happened when photographs were taken at angles designed to emphasize threat or diminish it for different audiences. He had a satellite phone in his right hand and a blanket over his shoulders and the particular unhurried movement of a man who believed he was safe. She told herself he is not safe. She told herself this is a clean shot at a lawful target under valid authorization. She adjusted her breathing. She told Calder she was going to the trigger. Calder gave her a wind call, 14 knots from the northwest, gusting to 17, current lull. She agreed with the number. She did not agree with the timing. She wanted the next lull, not the current one, because the current lull had come 4 seconds after a 17-knot gust, and the pattern she had been observing for the last 3 hours suggested the subsequent lull was longer and more stable. She waited. Calder said quietly, "You're past the window." She said nothing. She was counting. She was right. The next lull came. It ran 6 seconds. She took the shot in the second second of it, which is where she had learned, from hundreds of shots and nobody's instruction but her own failed results and corrected understanding, that lulls of this pattern in mountain air were most stable. The shot hit Zerari in the upper chest. He went down. Voss called the hit. Assault element began to move. Everything was proceeding correctly, and then 3 things happened in a sequence so fast that later, reconstructing it in her mind, she could never quite agree with herself on the exact order. The compound's generator went off. Every light died. The electric light above the rear door vanished. The single thermal camera feed the assault element was carrying lost its reference point. And then, from a position that nobody had identified in 11 hours of surveillance, a weapon opened up from the eastern ridgeline, not at the assault element, not at the compound, but directly at her hide position. Whoever was shooting was not aiming at a confirmed target. They were suppressing a grid square. They had approximate knowledge of where she was, not exact, which meant they had been told roughly, not precisely, which meant the intelligence leak was real, and it was somewhere downstream of her exact position data, which was a small consolation that meant nothing while rounds were impacting the frozen earth 12 to 18 inches from her body. She rolled left. She told Calder to move on her command. Calder had already moved, not because she commanded it, but because a round had clipped the equipment bag beside him and he had reacted to that before processing the tactic. His movement was right in outcome, wrong in sequence, and it created a gap between them that the terrain would make very difficult to close quickly. She keyed her radio. She said, "Cold front is in contact, eastern ridge, suppressed position, moving south." Hoax responded, "Copy cold front, we're taking fire from the compound, hold your approach." The assault element was pinned. She was alone, moving south along a ridgeline in -14 degrees of cold with a primary shooter somewhere to her east who was adjusting fire with each volley, which meant they had a spotter too, which meant they were a trained pair, which meant this was not an opportunistic response but a planned ambush. She ran, not carelessly. She ran the way she had been taught to move in denied terrain, using low points, using rock formations, never running on skyline, never committing to a direction until she had a reference point for cover. She was carrying 38 pounds of gear plus her primary weapon, and she had been in the cold for 11 hours, and her hands were performing at approximately 70% of their normal function, which she knew because she had tested them during the last hour of waiting, opening and closing her fingers against the stock in patterns. She used to measure her manual dexterity when temperature became a tactical factor. She did not drop the rifle. This matters. Later, when people tried to reconstruct what happened on that ridge and why she survived what followed, the rifle became a small symbol of something nobody could quite articulate. She had the chance to drop it. Dropping it would have made her faster by 4.8 kilograms and would have freed her dominant hand for other options. She kept it, partly because the rifle was mission critical and she had a professional obligation to the platform. Partly because she had made a calculation, fast and cold and quiet, that if she survived long enough to need it again, she would be glad she had it. She made it 200 meters south before the ground gave way. Not dramatically, not with a great crack of ice. The mountain in that region was a patchwork of frozen surface over hollow spaces, air pockets left by seasonal melt and refreeze that the surface layer concealed perfectly under starlight and night vision. She stepped wrong and the crust broke and she went down, not into an abyss, but into a depression 2 meters deep with a hard stone floor that she hit with her right side, her shoulder absorbing the primary impact in a way that she immediately knew had created damage. Not a break, a separation of some kind. The joint worked, but it burned with a heat that was sharp and wrong. She lay still for 12 seconds. She listened to the shooting above. It was moving south, which meant they had tracked her direction. She could not move south anymore. She could not move north without returning toward the contact. She looked at her options in the dark pocket of depression she was lying in, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes from having no good choices, that she was going to have to go east. Toward the shooter. Not at the shooter, east and then south, looping under the ridgeline and using the dead ground to come around behind the pursuit element. It was not a bold tactical choice. It was the only remaining direction that had geometry in her favor. She keyed her radio once. One click, distress signal. No voice because she could not know how close the pursuit element was and she did not want sound to give her position. The radio clicked back, twice. Hoax was acknowledging. He could not tell her what he was doing or where he was because he was in the same situation. If he was transmitting voice, he was advertising his position to the shooters inside the compound who almost certainly had radio monitoring capability. She moved east. Above her, on the ridge, Chief Hoax was dealing with a situation that had none of the features of a planned response and all the features of an improvised one, which is always more dangerous. The assault element had gone to ground behind a natural rock formation that provided cover from 3 directions but not the fourth being the mouth of the compound's main gate, which had been locked at mission start and was now open, suggesting the people inside had had warning and time to prepare. He had 2 operators forward, 2 back, himself in the center, and he was bleeding from a cut above his left eye from where a rock chip kicked up by a ricochet had caught him. Not serious, messy. He was also carrying the knowledge of Voss's radio call in his body like a stone. He had heard 1 click, distress. He had sent back 2 clicks, acknowledged. He had not sent, we are coming, because he did not know if he could. His element was pinned, and he had been in the business long enough to know that moving pinned men toward a secondary contact in darkness and broken terrain was the fastest way to turn a bad night into a catastrophic one. He needed to stabilize his own situation before he could do anything about hers. This is what military professional reality looks like, not the version in the stories where the right call is obvious. The version where 2 right answers are in direct opposition and you have to pick one knowing the other will cost something you care about. Hoax picked his element. He told himself she is mobile, she is trained, she knows what she is doing. He told himself the thing he needed to be true in that moment. He organized his element and they began to take the compound from the north. In the depression 200 meters southeast of the compound, Sierra Voss was doing something that no combat training doctrine had ever formally prepared her for, which was applying field improvisation to a separated shoulder while remaining silent in enemy-occupied terrain with her fingers at 70% function in -14 degrees. She braced the rifle stock against the stone wall of the depression. She turned her body. She controlled the movement with a care that was almost meditative. She relocated the joint. The pain was the kind that doesn't scream, the kind that arrives in a white flash and then recedes to a steady deep burn that sits below decision-making and lets you continue functioning if your mind knows where the line is. She knew where the line was. She had injured this shoulder before, not in combat, in training during a water extraction drill in the Coronado Surf Zone in cold water, in a situation where she had fought the current instead of working with it because she had been 24 years old and convinced that strength was always the answer. She had learned in the long weeks of recovery that followed, that knowing when to move with a force and when to oppose it was not a philosophical lesson. It was a technical one with real physical consequences. She thought about that briefly, not sentimentally, more the way you confirm a piece of information that is still accurate. Then she moved east. The pursuit element, she had identified two shooters from their muzzle signatures, and their pattern of adjustment fire had stopped moving. She could hear them, not voices, footsteps on frozen ground. They were pausing, which meant they had lost her, lost a track. In the dark and the cold and the complex terrain, they had estimated her direction and she had changed it, and now they were uncertain. Uncertainty in pursuit is gold. She moved south along a frozen drainage channel that ran at the base of the ridgeline, using the channel bed as a path because it was slightly lower than the surrounding surface, and in the dark, even a few inches of elevation difference can mean the difference between visible and invisible to a person scanning from above. She moved slowly, not from fear. From the understanding that slow movement in hostile terrain makes less sound and less visual signature than fast movement, and that arriving 30 seconds later alive was an infinitely better outcome than arriving 10 seconds earlier dead. The night around her was doing something she had noticed before in extreme cold at altitude. It was becoming luminous. Not brighter exactly, but the darkness had a quality to it that was different from low-altitude darkness, a kind of crystalline texture that made certain shapes more readable than they should have been. She could see the outline of the ridgeline above her clearly enough to navigate by. She could see the footprints she was leaving in the frost. She could see, when she turned her head south, a faint orange-gray quality to the sky at the horizon that was not dawn but was the edge of dawn's approach, perhaps 90 minutes away. Dawn was a deadline. Daylight would strip her of every cover she currently had. She needed to be either inside the compound or far away from it before first light. She ran the numbers in her mind: distance to the compound, terrain between, status of her element, status of the pursuit, her physical condition, her weapon's status. She had not fired since the initial shot, which meant she had a full magazine -1 plus a sidearm with 17 rounds plus 1 in the chamber. She made a decision. She was not going to run. She was going to find the pursuit element before they found her. This is the point in the story where I need you to understand something. The decision Voss made in that drainage channel is not the decision that training doctrine would have suggested. The recommended action for an isolated operator in a compromised overwatch position with a separated shoulder and compromised radio communication is to establish a defensive position and await rescue. That is the doctrine. That is what you do. She understood this. She was not unaware of it. She made a different choice based on a specific calculation that the doctrine writers had not considered, which was that she knew the sun was coming, she knew she was injured, and she knew that a defensive position in daylight with a separated shoulder was not a position. It was a waiting room. She chose to act instead of wait. This will become important later, when people disagree about what she did and why. She found the first shooter 14 minutes later. He was not looking for her. He had stopped moving because his partner had moved south along the ridge and he was holding position, providing overwatch for the active searcher. He was crouched behind a boulder, facing north, his rifle pointed up the ridgeline. He was looking entirely in the wrong direction, not through incompetence, because the last signal he had of her was north of him and he was covering the most logical return route. She came up behind him from the southeast. She made a choice in the last 4 meters that she would think about for a long time afterward. Not the tactical choice, that part was clear. The human choice, the moral accounting that happens in a fraction of a second when you understand that the thing you are about to do will be permanent and will change you in a way that training prepares you for but cannot complete. She made the choice. It was done quickly without sound. She took his radio. She took his weapon, a bolt-action rifle with a night vision-capable optic that told her something about the resources this network had access to. She noted the make, the model, the specific configuration of the optic, information she filed in the part of her mind that would write the after-action notes if she lived to write them. She moved south to find the second shooter. He found her first. He was moving north along the drainage channel, the same route she had used, because he was good enough to read the terrain the same way she had. They came around opposite ends of a large boulder formation and were approximately 3 meters apart when they saw each other. He was faster to his weapon, she was faster to her decision. She went inside his line of fire. Closing distance when an adversary has a weapon advantage removes the advantage, and at 3 meters in the dark, the variables that had been working against her, her injury, her cold hands, the weight and awkwardness of the field, became less relevant because neither of them could use their rifles effectively at that range. She had her sidearm in her left hand, her good hand, and used it. 2 rounds. He went down. She stood in the drainage channel for 5 seconds, breathing, not celebrating, not grieving, processing. Her radio crackled. Hoax compound is secure. What is cold front status? She keyed the radio. She said, cold front is mobile, 2 tangos down at grid, and she gave the grid. coming in from the southeast. Identify before you engage. A pause, then Hoax, copy, we have a man watching the southeast. You'll hear him whistle. She heard the whistle 3 minutes later. It was the most ordinary sound she had ever heard in her life, a two-note tone that someone used to call a dog or get a friend's attention, and she followed it across the last 100 meters of frozen ground to the compound gate. Hoax met her at the gate. He looked at her for a moment. He was a large man, wide-shouldered, with a face that had been in the weather for a long time. He had a cut above his eye that had been imperfectly taped. He looked at her shoulder, at the way she was carrying the captured rifle at her face, which she knew was doing something economical. He said, we called it in as a KIA. She said, I know. He said, I didn't have another option with the radio traffic. She said, I know, Darnell. He handed her a water bottle. She drank half of it. He handed her a compression bandage. She applied it to the shoulder with his help, which required a level of practicality from both of them that pushed past any awkwardness the moment might otherwise have carried. He said, the target. She said, chest hit, he went down. I lost visual on him when the generator went. Hoax said, he's inside, alive, but not for long. She looked at him. He said, the chest hit was good, but it was a through on the right side, missed center mass by 3 inches. He's in respiratory distress. We have a field medic on him. He said nothing for a moment. 3 inches. At 1100 meters in gusting wind and negative 14 degrees with cold hands, a 3-inch offset on a chest shot was not a miss by any standard measure. It was an extraordinarily precise result. But it was 3 inches from where she had aimed, and she knew why. The second lull had been good but not perfect, and she had overcompensated her hold for the wind by a small fraction that she had felt in the moment of the shot was correct. She had been wrong by 3 inches. In one sense, the mission was intact. The target was down, unable to communicate, dying in the compound he had believed was safe. In another sense, she had made an error of judgment in the most consequential moment, and she would carry that error as information about the limits of her own calibration in those specific conditions. Not as failure, as data, but data about something real. She walked into the compound. What followed over the next 2 hours was the procedural work of secure site exploitation, the systematic collection of intelligence materials, the documentation of the facility, the stabilization of the wounded, the coordination of extraction. It was work that required precision and care and had its own intensity, but it was work with a process, which was different from the night's earlier work, which had had no process at all. At some point during the exploitation, one of the younger operators, a man named Petri, 23 years old on his second deployment, came and stood near her without quite addressing her. He pretended to be organizing equipment. She let him pretend for a moment, then looked at him. He said, ma'am, how did you? She said, one thing at a time. He said, yes, ma'am. He went back to organizing equipment. She understood what he was trying to ask. She did not have the language to give him a satisfying answer, and even if she had, she did not think this was the right moment for it. She was cold. Her shoulder was burning. The night had cost something that she had not yet had time to calculate, and she needed to count the cost before she talked about it. The extraction helicopter arrived at 5:18, 41 minutes before first light. She sat in the rear of the helicopter with her back against the airframe, her rifle across her knees, and watched the compound disappear below. Hoax was across from her, eyes closed, not sleeping but resting in the way that long-experienced operators rest in transit, present enough to respond, disconnected enough to let the body recover what it can. The other operators were quiet. Petri had a small notebook that he wrote in on deployments, and he wrote in it now, which she had not noticed him do before, and which meant either he had been doing it privately or this night had moved something in him that wanted to be written down. At some point between the compound and the forward base, the radio in the cockpit crackled with the information that Task Force Nightfall had a KIA, Lieutenant Commander Voss, and that the casualty notification process had been initiated. Hoax opened his eyes and picked up the internal comms. He said, negative, cold front is on board. Repeat, cold front is on board, no KIA on this element. A pause, then the controller said, copy, stand by. She watched the mountain pass beneath them, pale and enormous in the early dark, and thought about how it had looked from 1,140 meters away, flat and readable through a scope, complex and hostile up close, and how that difference was perhaps a summary of everything she had learned about the work over 8 years. Distance made things seem simpler than they were. You had to get close to understand the actual problem. Commander Marsh heard the update before the helicopter landed. He was standing in the operations center and he heard the radio call and he stood very still for a moment in a way that the night duty officer, who was used to Marsh's particular brand of composure, noticed but did not comment on. Marsh said, "Get a flight surgeon to the LZ and get me Hoax's radio the moment they touch down." He did not say anything else. He picked up the notification folder that he had not opened and returned it to its proper drawer and locked the drawer with the small key that lived on his keychain next to the base access fob, and he went outside to wait for the helicopter. It was cold, the sky in the east was beginning to pale, the stars washing out at the horizon. He thought about what it meant that the Khalsin cold front had spent the night moving east toward danger instead of waiting for rescue, and he thought about the 3 senior officers who had filed formal objections to her deployment. And he thought about the specific form of correctness that feels like wisdom but is really just comfort. He had been right to fight for her. He had known he was right. He still felt the weight of having known it, because being right about a person in this work meant you had bet on them with other people's lives, and the moment of confirmation, the moment the helicopter touched down and she stepped off it with a captured weapon over one shoulder and her own rifle in her hand, was not a simple vindication. It was a reminder of everything the bet cost every time someone else placed it on someone else and was wrong. She walked toward him. She looked exhausted in the specific way that is not just physical, the particular depletion that comes from operating at the edge of everything you have for an extended period. Her shoulder was bound and her face had the remnants of frost in it still, caught in her hair and her collar, and she was walking with complete steadiness. She stopped in front of him. He said, "Welcome back, Commander." She said, "Commander," a pause. "The target is alive, barely. He'll need to talk to someone qualified before he decides to stop being alive." Marsh said, "Understood." Another pause. "Your positioning data was clean. The leak is upstream of the strike package briefing." She said, "I know. The shooter on the eastern ridge had approximate grid, not precise. Someone gave them a search area." Marsh said, "We'll find it." She said, "Yes, sir." They stood in the pale beginning of the dawn and neither of them said anything about the 11 hours on the ridge or the drainage channel or the 2 men who were no longer alive or the 3 inches that had made the difference between a clean kill and a prolonged situation. There would be time for that. After-action reviews had specific formats. There would be a room with a whiteboard and a lot of careful language and people who had not been on the mountain asking questions in the orderly way that institutions ask questions. She was already thinking about what she would say and what she would leave out and what she would describe in clinical terms so that the room could process it without having to feel it, because she had learned that the feeling was hers and the clinical language was the institution's, and there was a useful separation between the two that protected both parties. She went inside. Calder found her at the debrief staging area 40 minutes later. He had come back on a separate extraction. The field team had gathered the equipment she had abandoned in her movement and brought it in. He was carrying her spotting scope in a case and he handed it to her and then stood there. She said, "Good work tonight." He said, "I moved before your command." She said, "You moved when a round hit your equipment bag. That's a reasonable time to move." He said, "I should have held." She looked at him. He was young and serious and still wound tight from the night, and she understood what he was doing, which was the thing that serious young people do when they survive something that costs something. They look for the error, the thing they should have done differently, because the error is easier to hold than the randomness. She said, "We'll talk about it in the debrief. Write down what you remember while it's accurate." She paused. "You did good work, Calder. The wind calls were right." He said, "The second one was slightly off." She said, "By how much?" He said, "Maybe half a knot." She said, "Half a knot at 1100 meters is within acceptable margin." He said, "Was the shot within acceptable margin?" She said, "That's what the debrief is for." She picked up the spotting scope and walked away, because she needed to eat something and change into dry clothes and sit quietly for a period of time before she would be able to participate in any room with any whiteboard in any useful way. The debrief was at 900. It was conducted in a room that was too small for the number of people in it, which was a standard feature of forward base infrastructure and not something anyone commented on. Commander Marsh ran it. There were 2 intelligence officers, a flight operations specialist, Hoax, Calder, 3 of the 5 assault element operators, and a man from the agency who did not introduce himself by name or organization, but whose presence everyone in the room understood the shape of. Voss sat at the end of the table closest to the door, which she chose because it was the seat with the most wall behind her and the least foot traffic to her rear. 11 years of field experience had produced specific preferences about where to sit in rooms, and she had long ago stopped explaining these preferences. The debrief followed its structure. Hoax reported the assault element's timeline, the contact, the compound breach, the target status. The intelligence officer noted the signal's intelligence that had preceded the operation and the gap in the positioning data that had been transmitted to the network. The unnamed man made notes on a pad and asked 2 questions, both of which were about timing rather than action, and both of which Voss understood as being about the leak's operational window rather than anything anyone in this room had done. Then it was her turn. She walked through it, her timeline, her observations, her shot, the contact, her movement, her decisions. When she described going east toward the pursuit element rather than away from them, one of the intelligence officers looked up from his notes. He did not say anything. She saw the look and continued. When she described the engagement in the drainage channel, the same officer said, "Can you characterize the threat assessment at the time of the first engagement?" She said, "He was armed and in pursuit, and I was between him and the compound. Threat assessment was clear." He said, "And the second engagement was initiated by the adversary." She said, "Correct." He made a note. Marsh said, "Commander, can you speak to the decision to move east rather than establish a defensive position?" She said, "Yes, sir. I assessed that a defensive position in those conditions, with daylight approaching with a separated shoulder, would not hold. The doctrinal recommendation assumes a recoverable position. I did not have one. Moving toward the pursuit was the only direction with terrain geometry I could use." Marsh said, "That decision is going to be reviewed." She said, "Yes, sir, I expected it would be." He said, "I'm telling you because the review will come from people who weren't there, and it may take forms you find." He chose his word carefully, reductive. She said, "I understand, sir." The unnamed man looked up from his pad. He said, "The captured weapon, did you document the optic configuration before you handed it to the site exploitation team?" She said, "Yes, I can provide the written notation." He said, "Please do that." The debrief ended, people filed out. Hoax paused near her chair as the room emptied and said quietly, "You know what they're going to say about the call to move east." She said, "They're going to say I created an unnecessary engagement when waiting was the safer option." He said, "Are they wrong?" She looked at him. She said, "Tactically, from a remove of 12 hours and a warm room, they might have an argument. From inside that drainage channel with the sun coming up and 2 active pursuit elements and a compromised shoulder, I had no defensive position that would have held to extraction." He said, "Put that in the written report exactly as you just said it." She said, "I will." He said, "And Sierra," he almost never used her first name. "The shot was within margin. 3 inches at 1100 meters in those conditions is a result most instructors would have put on the board as a demonstration example." She said, "The target needed to not survive to make a phone call. He may survive long enough to make one." Hoax said, "That's a different problem. That's an intelligence problem. The shot was clean." She said, "Thank you, Darnell." He left. She sat alone in the emptied room for a moment. The whiteboard still had grid coordinates on it from the operational overlay. She looked at them without seeing them. She was thinking about the second lull. She was thinking about the specific calculation she had made and the specific way it had been 3 inches from correct. She was trying to decide whether the decision had been right or whether she had made a small error in the pressure of that moment, and whether it was possible to know the difference from inside the decision. She decided, as she always decided on this particular question, that the best she could do was build more data, shoot more, work more, understand the gap between what she intended and what resulted, and close it incrementally. Not by trying harder in the moment. Trying harder in the moment was not the answer. The moment was the result of everything before it, by doing better work in the long preparation before the moment. She wrote her after-action notes. She was specific and clinical, and the notes were 12 pages long. She submitted them to Marsh's office. Then she went to the medical section and had the shoulder properly assessed. The flight surgeon confirmed separation, no fracture, managed with a brace and rest and physical therapy that she would begin here and continue when she rotated back. He told her she should be off operational status for 6 weeks. She said, "I understand." He said, "6 weeks is a minimum, Commander." She said, "I understand, Doctor." He looked at her the way medical people look at special operations personnel when they say they understand but their eyes say they are already doing the calculation about what the 6 weeks means for the mission schedule. He said, "The shoulder will give you trouble permanently if you push it before it's stable." She said, "What is permanently?" He said, "Reduced range of motion, possibly chronic instability in extreme positions." She said, "Meaning it would affect precision work." He said, "At extreme ranges, yes, possibly." She sat with that. The shoulder was her support shoulder, the shoulder her rifle sat in. A permanent reduction in stability in the support shoulder was not a career-ending injury in most work. In her work, at the ranges she operated, it was a question mark that could grow into an answer she did not want. She said, "How long to know whether the damage is permanent?" He said, 8 to 12 months of proper recovery and physical therapy. If you do it right, you may have full function. If you push before it's ready, you're rolling a dice on the outcome." She said, "Thank you." She left the medical section and walked across the forward base in the morning light, which was now fully arrived and orange gold and warm feeling even though it was still below freezing. She found a spot against the outer wall of the operations building where the sun hit directly and stood in it and let it hit her face. She thought about the months ahead, the formal review of her decision-making, the shoulder, the debrief that would happen at a higher level when she rotated back, the 3 senior officers who had objected to her deployment and who would receive the after-action materials and who would read them in ways shaped by their existing opinions. She thought about her mother in Tucson who had no idea any of this had happened, who was probably finishing her early shift at the laundry right now, who had once asked Sierra, very carefully and without any accusation, why she needed to do things the hard way. She had said, "Because the hard way leads somewhere." Her mother had said, "So does the easy way, baby." She had not had a good answer to that then. She still did not have one. She thought that was probably important, the fact that she still did not have a good answer to her mother's question. It was honest. The hard way led to things, so did the easy way. What she had needed to do was specific. It was not about hardness for its own sake. It was about doing the particular thing she was built to do, in the particular way she was built to do it, in the places where it mattered. That was not a philosophy she could explain in a kitchen in Tucson. It was a thing that only made sense inside it. The sun moved, she moved with it. She had 6 weeks to figure out how to stand still in the right way. In the operations center, Commander Marsh was on a secure line to his superior at SOCOM, briefing the night's events in the careful language that institutional channels required. He covered the target, the compound, the breach, the intelligence hall, the status of the high-value target, still alive, still in medical instability, being held at the forward base pending transfer to a facility with qualified interrogators. His superior said, "And the female officer, the one you pushed for?" Marsh said, "Commander Voss performed within standard. Her field decisions are under review as per protocol." His superior said, "Did she produce the shot or not?" Marsh said, "She produced the shot, sir, at 1100 meters in adverse conditions. The target is in custody." His superior said, "The objections from the senior staff, were they documented?" Marsh said, "Yes, sir." His superior said, "And the outcome?" Marsh said, "Target is in custody, no friendly KIA, all operators recovered." A pause on the line, then, "Get me the after-action package when it's complete." Marsh said, "Yes, sir." The line went quiet. Marsh set down the handset. He thought about what his superior had asked, the objections, whether they were documented. He thought about the specific way that institutional accountability tended to work, how the documentation of an objection survived in a file long after the outcome it was wrong about had been absorbed into normal history. The objectors would be assessed differently in a world where she had not come back. They would be assessed the same, cautious, careful, professionally responsible, in a world where she had. The outcome changed lives, the paperwork was permanent. He thought that was not a problem unique to his work. It was something humans did in every institution, in every organization that had files and protocols and the need to demonstrate that decisions had been properly considered. He could not fix it today. He could document the outcome accurately and let the record carry what it carried. The formal review of Voss's field decisions took place 3 weeks later, conducted remotely via secure video conference because she was still at the forward base, beginning her physical therapy under the flight surgeon's supervision, and the reviewing body was in Coronado. The reviewing body consisted of 4 officers. 2 of them had been in special operations, 2 had not. The two who had been in special operations understood immediately and without needing to be told the specific geometry of the terrain she had described, what a defensive position in those conditions would have meant, why moving east had been the correct decision, how the calculus of the drainage channel engagement worked. They had questions, but the questions were technical. The two who had not been in special operations had different questions. Their questions were not wrong. They were earnest and careful and came from a framework that was real, the framework of doctrine, accountability, the institutional need to verify that operators were not making unilateral decisions based on personal preference when the standard operating procedure existed for valid reasons. She answered all of the questions. She was not irritated by the framework questions. She had been in enough formal reviews to understand that the framework existed because individual operators making unilateral decisions based on personal preference was a real problem that the military had a real interest in preventing. The fact that her decision had been right did not invalidate the framework. It just meant that this particular application of the framework would conclude that she had acted correctly. It did conclude that, unanimously. The formal finding was that her field decisions had been within acceptable parameters given the circumstances, with a note that the movementiste decision had been unconventional but defensible. Unconventional but defensible. She thought about those words for a moment when she read the finding. She thought about what they said about how institutions processed things that didn't fit the expected shape. Unconventional covered a lot of things, so did defensible. She put the finding in her file. Calder came to see her during the second week of her physical therapy. He knocked on the frame of the small office she had been given for the recovery period, which was the kind of gesture of formality that told her something had been on his mind for a while. She said, "Come in." He came in. He sat in the chair across from her desk. He was still wound tight, but differently now. The acute tightness of the night had faded and been replaced by something more settled, the kind of sustained discomfort that comes from processing rather than reacting. He said, "I've been thinking about the wind call." She said, "Which one?" He said, "The one I gave you before the shot, the 14-knot call." She said, "It was accurate." He said, "But you waited for the second lull." She said, "Yes." He said, "Because you disagreed with the timing." She said, "I had a different read on the lull pattern." He said, "I should have seen that." She looked at him. She said, "Calder, we had been together for 6 weeks. You read the wind correctly. The number was right. The timing judgment was a product of 3 hours of direct observation, which was mine to make because my position gave me the specific data point." He said, "So how do I learn that, the lull reading?" She said, "You accumulate data, you track lull patterns in specific terrain types in specific temperature bands, and you build a library of what you've seen and you compare it to what you're seeing. It takes time, it can't be briefed." He said, "You could write it down." She said, "Parts of it, the parts that are systematic, not the parts that are felt." He said, "How do you know the difference?" She said, "You find out by being wrong. You think something is systematic and it turns out to be felt, and you know that because in a different context the systematic rule fails and you have to rely on the felt thing, which you hadn't developed yet because you thought the rule covered it." He sat with that. He said, "Did you think you would come back?" She said, "From the drainage channel." He said, "From any of it, after the generator went." She said, "I didn't think in those terms." He said, "What terms did you think in?" She said, "Next step." He said, "That's the training." She said, "That's the training, and that's also what happens when you stop having access to any larger frame. When the situation reduces to small enough pieces, you work the small piece." He said, "And when you had to go east?" She said, "I had a direction with geometry in my favor and directions without it. I took the one with geometry." He said, "It wasn't that simple." She said, "No, but that's how it worked in practice." He nodded slowly. He said, "I'm going to be a better spotter." She said, "I know." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because you're asking questions that take longer to answer than they took to ask." He left. She sat in her small office with her arm in its brace and thought about what made someone good at the kind of work she did. Not the physical training, not the intellectual preparation, not even the specific technical skills that took years to develop. Those were necessary conditions, but not sufficient ones. The sufficient condition was harder to name because it lived below the level of instruction. It was something about the way you processed being alone in a difficult situation and the specific quality of decision-making that emerged when all of the safety nets of structure and communication and backup were gone. Some people found in that condition that they became smaller, that the loneliness of extreme circumstance contracted them into their smallest fears, and that from inside that contraction they could not access the resources they had built. Some people found that the contraction was temporary and that through it, on the other side of it, their resources were actually available, just in a different form, quieter, more economical, stripped of everything unnecessary. She had learned over a long time that she was the second kind. She had not known this about herself when she began. She had suspected it based on evidence from smaller situations and tested it incrementally in larger ones and discovered that it was consistently true. This was not a statement about courage or toughness. It was a statement about a specific psychological structure that she happened to have, and that could not be manufactured but could be discovered. Calder had the structure, she thought. She could see it in the questions he asked. He was in the process of discovering it, and the discovery was uncomfortable, which was how it always was. She began writing a document that she would not submit through any official channel. It was not an after-action report. It was not a training recommendation. It was a private accounting of things she had understood from the night that did not fit into clinical language. The specific texture of the 11 hours on the ridge, the quality of the decision-making in the drainage channel, what it had felt like to relocate the shoulder in the dark, what she had thought about and not thought about in the moments of engagement. She wrote it for herself, because she had learned from the years of this work that there were things that happened in the field that needed to be written down not for institutional reasons but for personal ones, because if you didn't write them, they accumulated in a form that was less useful. They became weight that sat in your body rather than information that you could examine and learn from and place in the proper context. She wrote for 2 hours. Then she put the document in a personal encrypted file and she went to do her physical therapy exercises, and she thought about Tucson and her mother and whether the early shift at the laundry was still the same 6 hours it had always been. Khalid Zarari died 7 days after the operation. The chest wound had been survivable with proper care, but the transfer to the facility with qualified interrogators had been delayed for 3 days by a logistical problem that Voss was never given the full explanation for, and by the time the transfer occurred, the infection in the chest cavity had progressed beyond what the facility's medical team could manage without equipment they did not have. He talked before he died, not much, not anything that broke the case open in a dramatic way. He gave 3 names that the intelligence teams could cross-reference against existing files. He said something about a border crossing point that they already knew about. He said something about a specific individual who had provided the compound's grid to the network, which confirmed the leak at a level that was useful but did not immediately identify the source. He said nothing about the shooter on the ridge, which meant either he had not known or he had chosen not to give that up even at the end, which itself was information about what he had valued protecting. The intelligence yield from the site exploitation was assessed as medium-high, not the breakthrough the operation had been designed to produce, but not nothing. Marsh wrote in his assessment that the operation had achieved its primary objective under compromised conditions, that the intelligence failure had degraded the outcome from the expected to the acceptable, and that the performance of the task force personnel had been professional and sound. He noted specifically the precision engagement at extended range and adverse conditions that had neutralized the high-value target and enabled the subsequent exploitation phase. He did not name her in the body of the assessment. Her name was in the attached personnel performance documentation. This was the correct procedure. He followed it exactly. The 3 senior officers who had filed formal objections to her deployment received copies of the full after-action package through the standard distribution channel. None of them filed any follow-up documentation. None of them communicated directly with Marsh about the outcome. One of them, the most senior, requested Marsh's assessment of her fitness for continued special operations assignment, which was a standard administrative request and not an unusual one. Marsh wrote exceptional in the relevant category fields. He attached the formal review finding. He attached his own assessment notes. He did not write, "I told you so." He was not built for that kind of vindication, and more importantly, he understood that it was not vindication that mattered. What mattered was the next time. The next objection from the next senior officer about the next person whose background was irregular or whose path was unrecognized. The outcome here was data that would sit in a file and could be cited. That was the function of outcomes in institutional settings. That was the slow, unromantic way that things changed. Petrie, the youngest operator in the assault element, the one who had stood near her during the site exploitation and tried to find the words, spent the next several weeks in the ordinary rhythm of the forward base. Training, maintenance, monitoring, the particular combination of boredom and readiness that characterizes life between operations. He wrote in his notebook regularly. He had been writing since his first deployment, mostly observations, things that struck him as worth remembering that didn't fit anywhere in the official reporting. He wrote about the drainage channel, not what had happened in it, he hadn't been there, what had been reported about it, what it meant to him as a piece of information about how people behaved under conditions that stripped everything down. He wrote, "She went east. When west was dead and north was contact and south was running away, she went east. That's not in any doctrine I've read. I think it's in something else. I don't know what to call it yet." He was 23. He had time to figure out what to call it. Hoax rotated out of the forward base 4 weeks after the operation. He had another 3 months left on his current contract, but an administrative reassignment moved him to a training role at a facility in Virginia. He did not particularly want a training role, but he understood that the rotation was partly protective, that after the night of the operation, which had been longer and more costly in specific ways than any after-action report would fully capture, the people who managed these things wanted him somewhere that would let him recover without anyone calling it recovery. He trained junior operators. He was patient with them in ways he had not always been patient in his own early career, which was a change that he noted without analyzing too closely. He told them things that were not in the formal curricula, not secrets, just the information that lived in the space between doctrine and experience, the kind that could only be passed person to person. He told one class when they were working on radio communication protocols under stress, that there was a moment in extreme field conditions when the radio became the most important and most dangerous thing you carried. Most important because it was the link to everything, most dangerous because what you said on it, and when you said it had consequences that radiated in multiple directions at once. He said, "I once transmitted a KIA that wasn't. I had a reason. The situation required it. The operator I reported KIA understood why after, but it changed things between us in a way that I can't fully describe, and that was real and that both of us are still carrying." A student asked, "Changed how, Chief?" He said, "Careful." The student said, "Sir." He said, "Changed careful. I'm more careful now about what I say I know, and when I say it, that's what I mean." He dismissed the class. He stood for a moment in the empty room and thought about the word careful and how it contained more than people usually put in it. Voss was cleared for operational status 11 weeks after the operation, 5 weeks later than the flight surgeon had recommended as the minimum. The shoulder had responded well to the physical therapy, not perfectly, but well enough that the flight surgeon was willing to sign off on a return to duty with a note that she should monitor the joint under extreme cold and report any instability in the support position. She reported to her next assignment at a facility in a different theater, which she did not discuss and which this account will not name, because some things that are real should not be made specific in a public telling. She called her mother before she shipped out. Her mother said, "How was the last few months?" She said, "Quiet." Her mother said, "You sound tired." She said, "I'm fine, Mom." Her mother said, "Are you eating?" She said, "Yes." Her mother said, "Vegetables?" She said, "Yes, Mom." Her mother said, "Okay, a pause, are you happy?" This was the question her mother always came back to, the one that Sierra never had a completely clean answer for, and that her mother asked anyway, every time, because she believed the question was worth asking even without a complete answer. She said, "I'm where I'm supposed to be." Her mother said, "That's not what I asked." She said, "I know." A silence, then her mother said, "Come home when you can." She said, "I will." She did not know when that would be. Calder was assigned to a different sniper element after the rotation. His new lead was a man named Graves, a veteran with 14 years in the work, methodical and quiet, whose style was different from Voss's in specific ways that Calder had to adjust to. Graves was more systematic, more inclined to trust the formula over the feel. Calder found himself in the first weeks of the assignment testing things, not undermining Graves's calls. Just watching, comparing what the formula said to what the specific conditions seemed to be asking for, trying to calibrate where the feel lived and where the formula was sufficient. He wrote to Voss once, a brief message through an official channel, to report that he was in a good assignment and that he had been working on lull pattern observation in desert terrain, which was different from mountain terrain, and that he had found 3 systematic rules that held and 2 things that seemed to require the felt reading. She wrote back, "That sounds right, keep going." He kept going. There's something this story has been building toward that I want to say plainly, because the story itself has been saying it in the way stories say things, through what happens and not what is explained. Sierra Voss did not receive a medal for what happened on that mountain. She received the formal review finding unconventional but defensible and a personnel assessment from Commander Marsh that used the word exceptional and the ordinary continuation of her career. This is not a flaw in the story. This is the story. The institutions that protect countries and defend populations are full of people whose most important work is never recognized in a ceremony, never named in a press release, never captured in any form that the public sees. This is partly because operational security requires it. It is also partly because recognition requires someone to do the recognizing, and the people in a position to do it are often working from frameworks that see unconventional but defensible as a category that sits below exceptional in the ranking, even when the outcome was the same. She had known this when she started. She had known it would be this way. She had made the choice anyway, which is the only kind of choice that means anything, the one you make after you understand the cost, not the one you make before. She had been called dead. She had walked out of the mountain that called her dead, and she had come back, not to prove anything to the people who had made the call, not to receive anything from them, just because the work was not done and she was still able to do it. That is not a simple kind of courage. It is not the loud kind. It is the kind that sits so close to the ordinary that most people looking from outside would not see it as courage at all. They would see a person doing her job. They would be both wrong and right. The mountain did not care about any of it. The mountain was still there, in its particular frozen enormity, with its hollow pockets under the frozen crust and its ridgelines that looked flat through a scope and were not, and its gusting wind that played with lulls in patterns that took 3 hours of patient watching to begin to understand. It would be there for the next person, and the one after that, and the one after that. This is how the work gets done, not in moments of impossible heroism. In 11 hours of stillness and one shot in the best available lull and one decision to go east when every other direction had run out. Petrie finished his third deployment 2 years after the mountain. He was 25 now, not 23, and the difference was not just the number. He had been in 3 situations since then that had asked him a version of the question the mountain asked. Each time he had found his way through. Each time what he had used was not what he had been formally taught, though formal teaching was part of it. What he had used was the thing he had been in the process of discovering at 23 when he wrote in his notebook, "She went east." He had found out what to call it. He called it direction without doctrine. The moment after you have ruled out every direction that the doctrine covers, what you do in that moment is not taught. It is built from every smaller version of the same situation you have survived before, built from watching other people navigate it and noticing what they do and why, built from asking questions that take longer to answer than they took to ask. He had a team now, 3 younger operators who had come to him the way he had come to the mission that night on the mountain, ready, trained, not quite finished. He told them things, not the same things Voss had told him, because she had given him what she had and he was giving them what he had, which was a different set of things built from a different accumulation. He told them one specific thing that he said came from a source he would not name, because the source was still active in a theater he could not specify, and nomming operational people was not something he did. He said, when you have run out of directions and you are choosing between bad options, choose the one that has geometry in your favor, even if it looks wrong from outside, especially if it looks wrong from outside. They wrote it down, not all of them. The ones who wrote it down were the ones who had already understood from their smaller situations that the work was in the details. The ones who didn't write it down would learn later from a situation that required it. That was fine too. That was how it happened. The notification folder that Marsh had never opened sat in its drawer in the operations center at Coast for another 8 months before the forward base was consolidated and the facility closed. When the administrative staff packed the operations center, a logistics specialist found the folder in the locked drawer during the inventory. It had Voss's name on it in the standard casualty notification format, and a date that was the date of the operation. The specialist noted it in the closing inventory as notification folder, unused, dated, retained for administrative record. No one was going to read it. No one needed to. The fact that it was unused was the record. The fact that it was unused was the entire story of the night, contained in a file that most people who read the closing inventory would pass over without a second look. Marsh by then was at a different assignment. He had received a promotion which he did not connect to any single operation, but which arrived in the way that these things arrived for people who consistently produced good outcomes, quietly, by accumulation, without ceremony. He kept the keychain with the small key on it. The key did not open anything anymore. The drawer it had locked was in a facility that no longer existed. He kept it because removing it from the keychain required making a decision to remove it, and he had not made that decision. There was a word for what Voss had done on that mountain that he had been looking for since the morning she walked off the helicopter with frost still in her hair and a captured weapon in her hand. He had not found it in the formal review language. He had not found it in the after-action report. He had not found it in any of the standard frameworks he used to assess performance. He had found it, eventually, in something his father had said to him when he was 17, before he went into the military, about the difference between the people who understood their work and the people who were only inside their work. His father had said that the ones who understood it could be taken out of their context and set down in a completely different context and still do something useful, because what they had was not a set of skills for specific conditions but a way of being in conditions. That the skill was a product of the way of being, not the other way around. He had remembered this at various points in his career. He had remembered it watching Voss in the debrief, answering questions about a drainage channel engagement with the same specificity and economy of language that she used to describe an 1100-meter shot. She had a way of being in conditions. It was not common, it could not be manufactured. The institutional question that kept him up at odd hours was how you identified it before you put someone in the conditions, how you created the circumstances for it to develop, how you ensured that the formal objections from the people who hadn't been in the field didn't prevent the people who had the way from ever being put in the conditions where it could emerge. He did not have a complete answer. He had a practice which was, fight for the people who show you evidence of it, document the outcomes, let the record do what records do, which is accumulate until the accumulation can speak for itself. It was not a fast way, it was not a satisfying way, it was the way that was available. He worked it. Voss, in her new assignment in the unnamed theater, encountered a situation in her 4th week that required her to train a local partnered force element in precision long-range work. It was not the assignment she had expected or the one that used her skills most directly. It was the assignment that the operational situation required. She trained them. She was patient with them in a specific way, not patient in the sense of not minding when they were slow, but patient in the sense of understanding that the slowness was a stage in the development and that accelerating past it was counterproductive. She identified in the group of 12, 3 who had the structural things she was looking for. She spent more time with those 3 without making it visible, because making it visible would have changed the dynamic in ways that were not useful. One of the 3 was a young woman, 22 years old, who had been assigned to the precision element through a combination of her own request and the assessment of a supervisor who had noticed something. She was not the best shot in the group at the start of the training. She was the most patient observer. She would watch a condition, wind, light, temperature change, the specific way the local terrain interacted with each, for longer than was comfortable. And then when she made a judgment about it, the judgment was more often right than the judgments of people who had moved faster to their conclusion. Voss noted this without saying anything for 2 weeks. Then she put the young woman in an observation exercise that required 11 hours of stillness in a cold, elevated position, noting micro-changes in environmental conditions at regular intervals. The young woman came out of the exercise with 8 pages of notes. She had noted things that Voss had not specified to look for. She had developed over the course of 11 hours a preliminary model of the local terrain's interaction with wind that was partially correct and partially not, and the incorrectness was in the places where she did not yet have enough data, not in the reasoning. Voss read the notes, she handed them back, she said, "Keep going." The young woman looked at her, she said, "Am I right?" Voss said, "In 8 places you are right, in 3 places you need more data, in 1 place you made a reasonable wrong assumption that more data will fix." The young woman said, "Which places?" Voss said, "Figure it out." The young woman went back to her observation position the next day. This is what training looks like when it is being done correctly, not the transfer of information from a full container to an empty one, the construction together of the capacity to know what questions to ask, the patience to let the questions develop rather than providing the answers before the questions are ready. Calder had known it, Petrie was learning it. The young woman in the unnamed theater was beginning to know it without yet having words for what she was beginning to know. The mountain was still there, the work continued. In Tucson, on a morning 6 months after the operation, Sierra Voss's mother drove to her early shift at the hospital laundry. She parked in the same spot she always parked in, 3rd row from the entrance, 2nd from the left. She punched in 8 minutes before her shift started because she was always 8 minutes early. She put on her work clothes and she tied her hair back and she began the day's work, which was the kind of work that no one thinks about when they think about what holds a hospital together, the clean sheet invisible labor that every patient in every bed depends on without knowing it. She thought about her daughter in the way she thought about her daughter every morning, which was briefly and specifically. A single clear image that came and went, like a photograph picked up and set down. Today the image was Sierra at 12 in the backyard, lying flat on the lawn for an entire afternoon watching a hawk that had landed in the oak tree. Just watching, not doing anything. Just watching until the hawk left, which took 4 hours, and then coming inside and eating dinner without saying a word about it. She had asked years later what Sierra had been thinking about during those 4 hours. Sierra had said nothing really, just watching. Her mother had thought, that's not nothing. She had been right. Before I let you go, I have to say something to you directly. You have stayed with this story for a long time today, and I think you know by now that this story was never really about a single night on a mountain. It was about what it takes to go east when every other direction has closed down. It was about the specific courage of the person who is called KIA and then walks out of the dark anyway, not for recognition, not for vindication, but because the work is not finished and they are still able to do it. If this story moved something in you, if it said something that you needed to hear, subscribe and stay in this community. We tell these stories because they matter, because the people in them are real even when their names are not. Drop a comment below and tell me which part of this stayed with you, and tell me where in the world you are watching from. I want to know. Until the next one, stay sharp, stay patient, and remember, the lull will come. Wait for the right one.